Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to pull back the curtain on the hidden engine that is actually running the global chip war. You know, when we read the news, the headlines are almost always dominated by massive foundries in Taiwan or tech giants out in California. But today, we're moving past those usual headlines to uncover a completely different story. We're looking at a nation that quietly controls the absolute foundation of modern technology. And by that, I mean they literally hold the keys to the smartphone in your pocket and the car in your driveway. There's a quote that perfectly sums up the core mystery of this whole global chip war. Every advanced chip on Earth depends on materials and equipment Japan controls, and almost nobody realizes it. Whether it's an AI processor, a smartphone brain, or military guidance system, it relies on a supply chain completely dominated by Japan. There's this huge misconception out there that Japan just sort of disappeared from the tech landscape after losing the memory chip wars of the 1990s. But they didn't disappear at all. Actually, they did something much smarter. They moved upstream to make themselves totally indispensable.
Part 1. The invisible monopolies, the canvas and the ink.
Okay, so to really grasp this power, we've got to look at the technical dependencies of how a microchip is actually made. It all boils down to two foundational elements. Let's start with the ink, which is a chemical called photoresist. Think of photoresist as the highly specialized invisible ink of the semiconductor world. When manufacturers want to draw these incredibly microscopic circuits onto a chip, they use a process called photolithography, basically shining light through a pattern. This photoresist reacts to that light to perfectly etch the circuit. And here's the kicker. This isn't just some simple recipe you can reverse engineer. It is completely non-negotiable. It requires highly guarded chemical formulations and trade secrets that took literally decades to master. Look at this. Japan controls a staggering 75% of this entire global ink market, mostly through companies like Tohog, JSR, and Shinitsu. And for the absolute most advanced chips being made today, the ones requiring extreme ultraviolet or EUV technology, well, Japan's grip is even tighter there. They hold an almost absolute monopoly on the most complex chemicals required for leading-edge tech. Now, if photoresist is the ink, then the silicon wafer is the canvas. These are circular disks of ultra-pure silicon. And when I say ultra-pure, I mean impurities are measured in mere parts per trillion. To put that into perspective, that is like finding a single, solitary drop of water in an entire Olympic-sized swimming pool. Crazy, right? The manufacturing expertise to hit that absurd level of purity took decades to perfect, meaning competitors can't just slap together a factory and expect to catch up overnight. And once again, Japan absolutely dominates. 56% of the global market share for these crucial 300mm silicon wafers is held by just two Japanese companies, Shinitsu and Sumco. Every major foundry in the world relies on these exact wafers arriving exactly on time and exactly to spec. There's absolutely zero margin for error here. So the crucial takeaway is this very simple but unbreakable dependency. You literally cannot make a modern chip without this exact sequence. You must start with the Japanese canvas. You must apply the Japanese ink, and only then can you use highly specialized equipment to etch the chip. It's a massive upstream choke point that completely dictates everything that happens downstream.
And speaking of that specialized equipment for Step 3, well, Japan controls a huge chunk of that too. Tokyo Electron is the third largest semiconductor equipment manufacturer globally. Screen Holdings dominates the cleaning process, but then you have a company like Lasertech. They're a relatively small company, but they hold the absolute keys to the kingdom. They make the only machine in the entire world capable of inspecting advanced EUV photomasks. Every single advanced fab on Earth has to use a Lasertech machine. There is simply no alternative.
To put it as bluntly as possible, if you remove Japan from the supply chain, the entire global chip industry just stops. The famous foundries in Taiwan, the massive memory plants in South Korea, the tech giants in America, they all completely freeze up without these specific materials and tools. No Japanese materials means no new electronics for the rest of the world. Period.
Part 2. The China Squeeze, Weaponizing the Choke Point.
So how does all this technical irreplaceability turn into a high-stakes geopolitical thriller? Well, let's look at the timeline. Prior to 2023, the US and the Netherlands restricted extreme ultraviolet technology from reaching China, but there was a loophole where slightly less advanced equipment was still flowing in. Then in July 2023, Japan joined this export control regime, throwing down restrictions on 23 distinct categories of semiconductor equipment. This effectively slammed that loophole shut, dealing a massive blow to China's domestic semiconductor ambitions. In response, China flexed its own leverage, retaliating by restricting the export of critical minerals like gallium and germanium.
This sets up a really fascinating clash of leverage. China's response was a retaliatory tactic, right? Basically cutting off raw rocks straight out of the ground. But Japan relies on deep structural leverage. Because of the insanely high purity requirements of the ink and canvas we just broke down, Chinese manufacturers simply cannot replicate Japanese materials in a few years, or possibly even decades. It's not just about building a shiny new factory, it's about trying to replicate generations of tacit knowledge and irreplaceable quality control. You just can't do that overnight.
Part 3. The Domestic Revival. Rebuilding the Fabs.
Recognizing this immense structural leverage they hold, Japan isn't just sitting back as a supplier anymore. Having learned the painful lessons of global supply chain disruptions, they're moving aggressively to physically rebuild their own chip manufacturing right at home. And they're using a brilliant two-pronged strategy to do it. On one side, they're partnering with the giant, TSMC, to build fabs in Kumamoto focused on mature, reliable chips for things like automotive and industrial applications. But on the other side is the Rapidus Consortium. This is a brand new, domestic alliance backed by major Japanese corporations, and they are swinging for the fences, aiming to build cutting-edge 2-nanometer chips by 2027. It's incredibly ambitious.
13. $1 billion. That is the staggering amount of government backing just for the Rapidus project alone. Japan is treating these domestic fabrication plants the way a country might treat a strategic petroleum reserve. This isn't just some standard economic investment for them, it is absolute national security insurance against any future disruptions.
Part 4. The Taiwan Hedge, Insurance for the Silicon Shield. This brings us to the ultimate strategic reason for all of Japan's aggressive investments: massive geopolitical insurance. Right now, Taiwan produces about 60% of all global semiconductors and a massive 90% of the most advanced chips. This extreme concentration means that any geopolitical crisis in that specific region would instantly sever the global technology supply line. The entire world economy is just incredibly vulnerable to this single point of failure.
So Japan's goal here is remarkably methodical. By holding the monopolies on those essential materials, the highly guarded ink, and the ultra-pure canvas, while simultaneously rebuilding massive domestic foundries, they are positioning themselves as the indispensable alternative. If the worst happens and the primary supply is severed, Japan aims to be the last remaining source of advanced semiconductor capacity in an allied country. They are making themselves way too valuable to abandon and entirely too integrated to sideline.
It really seems like the country that supposedly lost the manufacturing wars of the 1990s has actually, quietly but decisively, won the supply chain wars of the 2020s. By controlling the invisible materials that make absolutely everything else possible, they built a true fortress. Which leaves us with this final thought to consider. Based on their massive investments and unbreakable material monopolies, can Japan really become a semiconductor superpower again? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. Let that question simmer, and I'll catch you next time.